Hola y bienvenidos al episodio 19 de CFI Podcast. De Querétaro, Mexico, soy Nick Zautra. Okay, that's my Spanish practice for the day. Hello and welcome to episode 19 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Querétaro, Mexico, I'm Nick Zautra. Today on the podcast, I am very excited to welcome my former master's advisor to the show, Dr. Jason Scott Robert. Jason holds the Lincoln Chair in Ethics and serves as Senior Ethics Advisor to the Provost at Arizona State University. Jason is also Director of ASU's Lincoln Center for Applied Ethics and the Dean's Distinguished Professor in the Life Sciences. Jason's teaching and research are the intersection of bioethics and philosophy of biology. Jason's scholarship currently focuses on the justification of research in the so-called translational pipeline from bench to bedside, and his research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the James S. McDonald Foundation, and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. In addition to his scholarly work, Jason serves on ethics committees in the Phoenix area and on the board of the nonprofit Research Animal Retirement Foundation. Jason moved to Arizona State in 2004 from the philosophy department at Dalhousie University, where he was assistant professor and CIHR new investigator. Jason earned his PhD in philosophy at McMaster University in 2000, where he also earned his master's in 96, and his undergraduate studies were at Queen's University at Kingston. In his spare time, Dr. Robert, Jason, trains for and participates slowly in triathlons and in running and cycling events, his words, and he also collects and restores fountain pens, an interesting hobby that I just learned about. So I am extremely grateful to have Jason on the show and just basically to have met him. If it wasn't for Jason, I would not have turned toward philosophy of science and have been introduced. He was extremely helpful in meeting with me, just an undergraduate student who's generally interested in some of the epistemic questions related to modeling in the sciences. And he was more than happy to bring me on board, even invited me out to a workshop at Woods Hole one year. So, in addition to being an excellent researcher and scholar, I'd say Jason, is a model example of excellence in terms of advising and helping students to succeed. Okay, well, without further ado, I'm very happy to introduce you to Jason. Let's bring him in. So tell us, where did we get started, Jason? Where were you born?
So I grew up in Canada, and in Montreal in particular. And when I went off to university, I knew I wanted to do philosophy, but I didn't know what in particular I wanted to study. And the main reason I wanted to study philosophy is that this girl I had a crush on thought philosophy was very, very hard, and I thought this would be a good way to win her over. Not the best, most sort of, straightforward and compelling epistemological reason to study philosophy, but that's what happened. And turns out I was good at it and enjoyed it very much. So I did my undergraduate degree at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. And Queen's now has actually a really interesting group of folks who work in philosophy of science and science, technology, and society, science studies, including Sergio Sismondo. He came to ASU he came to Queen's about the same time that I left there in '94, so I didn't get to know him. But back then I was really interested in feminist epistemology, and I was also interested in postmodern philosophy, including the work of Michel Foucault. So I went from Queen's on to McMaster University, which is in Hamilton, Ontario. And I went there specifically because there was an epistemologist whose work I found really compelling and with whom I wanted to study. And he's nowhere near as well known as I think he should be. His name is Barry Allen. Barry was a tremendous asset as an advisor to me, not least because well, there are two things, really. He pushed me harder than anyone else ever has to really think about making connections between the huge number of ideas I have running around in my head at any given time that I can see how exactly they fit together, but maybe not everybody else can. So he really helped me to become much more explicit in my writing. And then secondly, he was amazing in that when he realized that I was especially interested in the biological sciences, he actually went out and learned enough about evolutionary biology, developmental biology, and neuroscience to be able to stay one step ahead of me and really be able to push me, even though that wasn't his area.
So Barry's an epistemologist, first and foremost?
Yeah,
okay.
He's an epistemologist. I mean, his first book was called Truth in Philosophy, and it was about changing conceptions of that notion over the millennia of philosophical inquiry. But more recently, around the time that I finished my doctoral work, he published a really interesting volume on knowledge and civilization that brought together a lot of anthropological and archaeological material, along with some evolutionary science and epistemology more broadly, in order to tell a story about aspects of human cognition that he would never have been able to tell that story had he not invested so heavily in learning the science in order to be able to supervise me. So it was a real win-win situation.
So you learned from Barry. Where did Barry learn from?
Well, Barry's PhD advisor was Richard Rorty.
Oh, Rorty, yeah.
Yeah, famous pragmatist philosopher. Barry was one of Rorty's students at Princeton, and Barry learned a lot from Rorty, but then also distinguished himself quite dramatically from Rorty's work as he moved into his own. And for what it's worth, now a lot of the stuff that Barry Allen does has to do with Eastern philosophical traditions, including Eastern epistemology and aesthetics, which is work that I think he'd always been interested in, but really started to develop over the last decade or so.
Great. So you were...
McMaster from 1994.
Mm-hmm.
I was at McMaster from 1994 until 2000. During that time, I did a master's thesis that was really a thesis about Michel Foucault and the Human Genome Project. And it was a weird combination. There was virtually no literature that brought those two areas into contact with each other. But I was so enthralled with thinking through the kinds of epistemological and really sort of large-scale epistemic changes that were taking place, with the emphasis on DNA and in particular the genome as
So what kind of questions? What kind of changes?
Well, so what was happening around in the 1990s in particular, this is when the Human Genome Project was funded quite dramatically in the U.S. in particular, but also elsewhere, including in Japan and in the UK, and a little tiny bit in Canada as well, where I was. And I was especially interested in the ways in which the Human Genome Project was sold to the American public and to the various folks in Washington, D.C. who ended up having a particularly heavy hand in ensuring that the project was funded, that the project changed in response to changes in technology and external pressures, and then to the ways in which the post-genomic era, since about 2003, has really developed. So for me, what was fascinating was the way it was being sold was that once we understood the genetic basis of human being, we would have two things. We would have a complete understanding of what it means to be human, and at the same time, we'd have a complete understanding of how humans differ from other animals. And the Human Genome Project was actually an interesting collection of projects, including the sequencing, mapping and sequencing of the genomes of a number of model organisms, including C. elegans. And the idea was that we'd be able to do some comparative genomics to really understand what makes worms worms and what makes humans humans, and so forth. And then the claim was that once we have a full understanding of human biology, thanks to genomics, we would be able to intervene in everything from Alzheimer's disease to musculoskeletal disease,
sure.
MS, to everything, and totally revolutionized the way in which medicine is practiced, and move on to this moment of precision or personalized medicine that people are still promising today.
Sure.
So I'll admit, back in '92 when I first started reading about this stuff, I was a massive skeptic.
Okay.
Remain a massive skeptic, and for all sorts of good reasons, I think. Back then, though, it's not clear that I had good reasons. I just had a hunch that something was missing in the stories that were being told. And I didn't know what it was. And I hadn't done a whole lot of biology up to this point. I hadn't actually taken any biology courses in college, though I had always had an interest in learning more about what the sciences could teach us. And so for me, it was a really interesting move when I was working on my master's thesis to start reading a lot more of the biology to see how geneticists and now genomicists were talking about DNA, and then also reading about how clinicians, physicians and nurses and others were talking about it, and then also how ethicists in particular were. So around 1992 to 94, most of the literature about the Human Genome Project fell into two categories. It fell into really sort of a kind of raw cheerleading, or a really reductionistic view of biology, especially human biology. And at the other extreme, there was a very strong, this is a terrible idea, a waste of money, and is very likely to lead to a new era of eugenics.
Now, who was saying that? What kind of people were making those claims?
Both clinicians of various sorts, as well as ethicists, some religious leaders and others. There was just a concern that there was an oversimplification of development and potentially also of evolution that would lead us to make bad decisions on the basis of an incomplete science. Now, though that was the bulk of the literature at the time, there was also a lot of stuff in between that was much more. So there was a lot of work done by folks like Sahotra Sarkar, who's a fascinating philosopher of biology at the University of Texas at Austin now, but he was writing about the ways in which genetic reductionism was going to completely bias our understanding of human biology. He wasn't worried so much about the ethical consequences of this in this work. He was really worried about the epistemic consequences of, if you like, a single level focus on understanding a biological entity. And at the same time, there were a number of other prominent biologists who were concerned that the genomic point of view might not be all that it's cracked up to be, that there was going to have to be a lot more work done at a more organismal level, and beyond that at a more ecological level, in order to be able to really understand the human being as well as any other kind of animal. And so a small group of philosophers of science started to work in this area in the 1990s, folks like Philip Kitcher and Ken Schaffner, who's just now retiring from the University of Pittsburgh, and a few other folks were sort of on the cutting edge here, and other people a little bit later, like Paul Griffiths in Australia now. These are folks who began to really grapple with the philosophical issues in human genetics, and I was reading some of their work, but also trying to sort of wrap my head around what else was missing. So back to the narrative, back to the timeline, 94 to 96 is when I'm writing my master's thesis. And basically what I was reacting to was sort of three phenomena. One was that there were a lot of biologists who were very excited about the human genome and didn't know anything about ethics, but had lots to say about ethics. There were clinicians who didn't know anything about the human genome or about ethics, but who had a lot to say about both of those things. And then there were ethicists who knew a lot about ethics, but nothing about the human genome, who also had a lot to say. And I wasn't so interested in the content or the, whether they were pro or con with regard to sequencing the human genome. What I was interested in was what sort of epistemic perspective they were taking, what was the evidence base for the claims that they were making. And I started to realize when I was working on my master's thesis that the only way I was going to be able to potentially really get at understanding the ethical issues, which is what had initially been driving me was to really start to grapple with the biological issues as well. And so I remember a moment when I was writing my master's thesis. I turned it into Barry Allen and asked him to read it, and he said, "Yep, chapter 1's here, chapter 3's here, chapter 4's here, but you're missing chapter 2." And I said, "No, there is no chapter 2." And he says, "Yes, there is. You just haven't written it yet."
Oh, great!
Gap in between a diagnosis that I was offering the sort of outline of in the first chapter, and the kind of solution I was proposing in what then were 2 and 3, but turned out to be chapters 3 and 4. So I ended up sitting down and basically writing chapter 2, which turned out to be my first serious work in philosophy of biology. And I was doing it almost in the dark, in the sense that Barry, as an epistemologist, wasn't an expert in this domain. There was one philosopher of biology at our sister campus at University of Guelph, now at Florida State University, Michael Roos, very famous philosopher of biology, but he and I didn't actually interact very much when I was a master's student, so I didn't get anything from that relationship, and so I was kind of doing this in the dark. And nonetheless, I pulled something out that turned out to be the basis of the doctoral dissertation that I ended up writing, and I stayed at McMaster University to do that. And in order to succeed there, working now in the philosophy of biology, I still wanted to work with Barry. I had to make sure I was also working with other philosophers of biology, and so was very fortunate that I had the opportunity to take some classes with Ian Hacking in philosophy of science more generally, and then to take some classes.
Oh, was he at McMaster?
He wasn't. He was at University of Toronto, which is about an hour down the road.
Oh, okay.
It's a reciprocal program whereby we could take courses for credit at the other Ontario universities. So I managed to do that, as well as take a class or two with Michael Roos, and also strike up a connection with one of the most, I think, prolific and influential philosophers for me, William Wimsatt, who was at the University of Chicago, and who's now, I think, semi-retired and spending some time at University of Minnesota.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think he's in Minnesota.
So Wimsatt was a terrific mentor to me, and I managed to secure in 1998 a Fulbright scholarship to spend a year at the University of Chicago working with Bill Wimsatt to really learn a lot more about the biological sciences about which I was writing in my dissertation. So I had this fantastic experience. I spent the...
how'd you like Chicago when you were there?
It was fantastic. So I was there from March till December 1999. It was a tremendous experience for me. I took my first course in developmental genetics there, or at least I audited my first course in developmental genetics with a very, now incredibly prominent a biologist by the name of Nipam Patel. And because at the time the program was called Conceptual Foundations of Science, now it's Conceptual and Historical Studies of Science. But when it was Conceptual Foundations of Science, there was a strong emphasis, and maybe this is still the case, on having students really know the details, the nitty-gritty of the science about which they were writing on the topic of the conceptual foundations.
Now, when you were coming up in Chicago and in McMaster, were there other philosophers of biology or others that working alongside that were not immersing themselves in the science?
Well, sure. I mean, I think, in fact, the long history of philosophy of biology is more or less, with some exceptions here and there, a history of philosophers doing one thing and scientists doing something else, and never the twain shall meet. It certainly wasn't the case for, I think, a very long time in philosophy of biology that the details of the science actually came into serious consideration in the philosophical work. I think that led to two problems. One of them was that the biological sciences were not being engaged at all, so there wasn't any serious outcome of philosophy influencing the trajectory of biological research. And simultaneously, the philosophical work was divorced from the practical realities of the science in ways that made it a little bit sterile and a little bit insular.
Sure.
I realize that's a sort of massive overstatement of the case, and there's always going to be exceptions of philosophers of science, philosophers of biology. But I think it's fair to say that the norm until about 2000 was for philosophers of biology, broadly, but at least to engage in the technical details of biology. Now, by contrast, it's rare to see somebody graduate who has a PhD in philosophy with a concentration in philosophy of biology who doesn't have some serious either wet bench or computer simulation in the biological. Mm-hmm. And so one little anecdote that's interesting to me is when I was at the University of Chicago in '99, I remember one of my first weekends there, I went out to a conference that Bill Wimsatt had put together, and afterwards there was a really terrific party at a Chinese restaurant in Chinatown. And at that restaurant I happened to be sitting beside some of Bill's current and former students, and one of them was a guy named Bill Sterner, who was doing some work on, I guess we would call it artificial intelligence, although it's a broader area than that. And it was fantastic to sit there and talk to him. I found him really inspiring. And now here we are in 2016, and on faculty here at ASU, we have a brand new philosopher of biology, and this is Bill Sterner's son, Beckett Sterner, who did his PhD at University of Chicago and has now joined us in the Biology and Society program in the School of Life Sciences at ASU. So ends up being kind of a small world. And Beckett is somebody who studies the ways in which biologists use maths. And so in particular, he's been involved in some computational and modeling-based work over the years of his training. And now that he's at ASU, he's going to be collaborating with a number of the folks who work on mathematical dimensions of biology or biological dimensions of mathematics or whatsoever he finds himself interested in.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
So, yeah, absolutely. And I think, you're right to bring up this question about what ended up, what was the norm at the time. It really was the case that there were very few folks actively learning the details of the biology in order to help enhance their philosophy of biology work. But what's interesting and sort of what makes me stand out in a weird kind of way is that despite the fact that I was learning biology in order to do better philosophy of biology, I was actually learning philosophy of biology in order to do better bioethics. So my ambition had always been to be able to contribute to debates about the ethics of scientific research, biological research, and maybe also medical practice. But
now, I'm curious though. How did this come about? How did this motivation develop for you?
So
seeing the science and you feeling like you have something to say regarding this.
Yeah. So it's a good question. Back in the 90s when I was working on my undergrad and graduate work, ethics was probably the thing that captivated me more than anything else, ethics and epistemology. And it turns out that those two come together quite beautifully when we start talking about science and values. And so for me, that science and values domain was really the focal point of a lot of my scholarship. And the idea had always been that I wanted to do bioethics, not necessarily biomedical ethics, but bioethics, ethics of biological research. And so for me, that was the ambition was to learn biology, to do better philosophy of biology, and then to do philosophy of biology in order to do better bioethics. And so I started teaching bioethics when I was a graduate student at master. And now here we are in 2016, and I have I hold something called the Lincoln Chair in Ethics, and I run the Lincoln Center for Applied Ethics at Arizona State University. And these are both as a function of the work that I've done in bioethics. Now, that said, there's an important observation I want to make, and it goes back to about 10 years ago. Very famous bioethicist who also started off as a philosopher of science is a guy named David Magnus. And Magnus is at Stanford and runs the Biomedical Ethics Center there. Magnus said to me, that it's impossible to be both a leading bioethicist and a leading philosopher of biology. I have to choose one. He said there are no examples of people who've managed to do both. And I sort of laughed it off initially, and then I thought of it as a challenge, and now I realize that he's probably right.
You're essentially doing this.
I am trying to do both, but it's not clear to me that I'm a leading figure in either field. And I suspect that had I continued on my trajectory in the philosophy of science, philosophy of biology, published my book in 2004, which was in part the dissertation and then a bunch of new stuff beyond that. From that, I moved on to doing more work in bioethics and trying to publish in both domains. Now, though I still get invited occasionally to do some work in philosophy of biology, for the most part, the work that I'm doing is either in bioethics or at the intersection of bioethics and philosophy of biology, such that it doesn't look to bioethicists like bioethics research, and it doesn't look to philosophers of biology like philosophy of biology.
Oh.
So it's this weird liminal space. That's okay.
I think there's been some philosopher who's written about the middle ground, being perceived this way. It's interesting because it's in between philosophy and or philosophy of biology and ethics, as opposed to being too much of a scientist or too much of a philosopher.
Exactly. So it's a different kind of sort of uncomfortable other space to be operating in. But I'm really fortunate. I have tenure, and interestingly, potentially for your audience, I have tenure in the School of Life Sciences at ASU.
You should tell us how did it come that a philosopher of biologist interested in epistemology and ethics like yourself winds up in a science department?
Yeah, so it's a weird story, and I think it's probably the most important defining aspect of my career. My first position after I graduated from McMaster was as a postdoctoral fellow and then as a faculty member on the tenure track at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Fantastic, quite small, but really important philosophy department on the east coast of Canada. I was exceptionally happy to be there, and there definitely were some folks there who really appreciated the value of embedding oneself in the biological sciences in order to do better philosophy of biology, and folks who thought it was important to really hang around with clinicians if you wanted to do biomedical ethics. And so for me, it was a good home. But at the same time, it was also the case that there was some institutional and really departmental pressure for me to really be more of a traditional philosopher, a philosopher who writes for a philosophical audience on philosophical topics that wear their value, their philosophical value on their sleeve. And I'll admit that wasn't a very comfortable position for me to be in. I also had an interesting experience. I happened to have had some large grants from the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and the Stem Cell Network in Canada. So I had significant research money, and that also had me traveling more and engaging a little bit in some empirical research, more qualitative research that was fairly unfamiliar to the philosophers there. So I increasingly felt I wasn't fitting in, and when Arizona State University in 2003 advertised a position for a philosopher to do bioethics in the School of Life Sciences, as a faculty member in the School of Life Sciences, I thought that this was my day, my opportunity potentially to really springboard into a new and more fast-paced career where I didn't have to meet the philosophy department instead. I really wanted to do, and ASU has been an amazing home for me. So I'll point out, just last week, the Center for Biology and Society here celebrated 20 years of the Biology and Society program, which began as a major within what was then the biology department. And then when the School of Life Sciences was formed in 2002, 2003 or so, the Biology and Society major stayed, and also there had been a growth in master's and doctoral programs in biology and society And those are all administered through the School of Life Sciences. And so I've been here for now, this is my 13th year on faculty here, and it's been an amazing place to do the kind of work that I do without having to be concerned about disciplinary considerations. It's also challenging. I'm evaluated by the standards that are established for the School of Life Sciences when it comes to annual review and
how are these standards maybe different from a more traditional analytic philosophy department?
Yeah, so in the sciences, of course, there are a couple of major expectations. One of them is that you'll be producing a significant number of grant applications on an annual basis, and secondly, that a good number of those applications, at least 20% of them, will be getting funded. So whereas in a standard philosophy department, a graduate student who comes in with a fellowship is going to be funded by the university. In the sciences, very often the funding is supplied by faculty members' grants, and so we're in a place whereby having graduate students generally or typically historically would have required us to have large grants. And to be honest, since I moved to the States, I have not had anywhere near the success that I had in Canada in securing significant funding for my research. And so we've been really fortunate that the School of Life Sciences has developed here a standard for assessing us that says basically we need to bring in enough research money in order to remain productive as scholars. And so as long as we're being productive, the actual dollar value of the grants we bring in doesn't matter. And so we've had folks who've been promoted and tenured with very little grant funding, but really terrifically good productivity in terms of papers and books and conference presentations and all that stuff. So I am...
So in terms of productivity, what does this look like? Are we talking, a book every 2 years, a couple papers every year? What are people putting out these days?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. There's a lot of variety here. So some of my colleagues in the School of Life Sciences in the program that I'm in really are book writers more than anything else.
Is that typically the historians, or is that also some of the philosophers?
That's quite typical of historians, although for what it's worth, the historians and philosophers in the School of Life Sciences seem to publish more books and more articles than the historians and philosophers outside of the School of Life Sciences. And I'm not quite sure what drives that, except that it probably has something to do with the culture of the department. But certainly, books are not recognized with the same degree of validity. And,
sure, it doesn't. It's not quite the currency that the Academy judges. Yeah,
exactly. At the same time, though, increasingly the biologists here realize that the amount of work it takes to put together a good book is the amount of work it takes to put together a pretty extensive list of journal publications. And so maybe it's the case that we can actually compare these to each other rather than treat them as completely different. Sure. So productivity varies fairly dramatically from the folks who are primarily book publishers to the folks who are primarily article writers. But for what it's worth, I do think that the folks in what's called the Human Dimensions of Biology program here in the School of Life Sciences tend to have a higher productivity than their counterparts in history or philosophy departments around the country. I say that, with some trepidation because I've been nowhere near as productive in terms of scholarship as I would have liked over the last few years.
Sure.
Now that my position at the university is 75% administrative and only 25% teaching and research.
Oh, and so how has that transition been? Going from primary on almost... Well, what was it before? About 20% administrative, would you say, or 0% administrative?
Yeah, for the first couple of years, it was pretty well 0% administrative, but 20% service.
Sure.
And it certainly changed over the time I've been here. I had sort of my first initial excursion outside of traditional appointment here was when ASU rented me as well as some biology faculty out to the University of Arizona College of Medicine Phoenix campus when they were first getting started. And so 50% or 70% of my line was rented out to the University of Arizona for a couple of years to develop their ethics curriculum, in which I also built some philosophy of science and philosophy of medicine. And then when I came back full time to the faculty in the School of Life Sciences, I had a couple of years of sort of regular appointment before my second excursion, which was when I took on the directorship of the Lincoln Center for Applied Ethics, and I also serve in the provost's office as senior ethics advisor to the university provost. So together, those positions end up occupying a significant chunk of my time, so I'm way less productive. And so, just to plug one thing moving forward, one of the things that's been especially interesting to me this year is I finally learned just how important it is to have really terrific supporting staff. And I now have a really wonderful set of colleagues. I have an assistant director and 3 program leads, one in research, one in education, and one in outreach, between whom we're able to get a significant amount of work, administrative work done with regard to the center, which also then frees me up to be a little bit more productive as a scholar. And so right now, some of the projects I've been working on this year include a new co-edited volume of the 1818 edition of Frankenstein by Mary Shelley that has been annotated for scientists, engineers, and creators of all types. Mm-hmm. So the idea was really to take this text, which is going to be turning 200 years old the year after next, and to bring it into focus for a STEM audience. It's always been in focus for a literary audience.
Yes.
It's one of the most assigned books in the humanities, but it doesn't quite have the same life outside of the humanities. And so with 2 colleagues here, Dave Guston and Ed Finn, we've put together this new edition of Frankenstein annotated for scientists and engineers that will be coming out with MIT Press in the spring of 2017. So that's been a terrifically fun project, bringing some history, philosophy, ethics, and literary work to bear on this important piece of historical fiction.
Oh, absolutely.
And I've also now had a chance to really start to come back to two projects that have been of significant interest to me for a long time, but about which I haven't been able to publish given other constraints. One of them is the work I've been doing on trying to understand the whole idea of translational research, and the other is a project on how to understand the ways in which scientists ought to be attempting to justify the research that they do, not only to each other, but also to the public at large, especially if they'd like to continue to receive government investment in their scientific research.
So now, when you talk about translational research, are you talking about the particular field of research with that which individuals work at the interstices of different disciplines in an effort to translate that work, or is there something?
So I mean, well, it's an example of that. Although in particular, what I'm interested in is the what work it's going to take in order to turn discoveries in the so-called basic sciences at the bench into innovations that are going to affect patients at the bedside.
Sure.
And there's been this long sense that there's a quite vast and deep translational gap between the bench and the bedside. And so I've been working now, I guess it's almost 15 years on the ways in which we might be able to accelerate translation in particular domains, but also to try to figure out why it is that translation doesn't just happen, why it is the case that findings at the bench are not somehow almost automatically translatable into innovations that matter in the real world. So that's been a project that, again, as I say, has preoccupied me for a long time, and now I have a chance to focus a little bit more specifically on it, and at the same time also worry about this general problem of justification. And for what it's worth, they're related, because one of the ways in which a lot of scientists, especially biological scientists, have attempted to justify their work in order to secure grants is by promising cures or treatments or solutions to real-world problems. So making a translational promise has been part of the justificatory strategy that many biologists have used and some would say have been forced to use thanks to the ways in which the dynamics of public support for science work in this country and elsewhere.
Do you know when historically that started to become mainstay in the kinds of grants and applications we see around today?
I published a piece a number of years ago with Jane Meyershine, Rachel Ankeny, and Mary Sunderland that suggests that things really started to happen after about 1993-94 when Newt Gingrich's work that ended up resulting in the contract with America and the Government Results and Performance Act and so forth, or Government's Performance and Results Act, when that started to happen, when there was a very strong sense that we need to be getting something for our public investments in science. But other folks have traced it back earlier still to the Bayh-Dole Act in the early 1980s that created, if you like, incentives for the commercialization of university research. So it's either been 30 some odd years or 20 some odd years that has really been what's driven, been the time frame within which this idea of justifying research by promising results. Of course, there are other ways to think about it. Maybe it goes back to the war on cancer. Maybe it goes back, to other examples. And it's not clear that I have a definitive answer here, but I really do think that we've seen it become commonplace over the last 22, 23 years.
So what kind of work are you hoping to do? You say you have the opportunity to do this now. What kind of suggestions or claims you're hopefully trying to make?
So for the most part, the work that I'm doing now is pulling together the results of lots and lots and lots of talks that I've given over the years, along with some interviews I did under an NSF-funded grant on model organisms in the neurosciences and in evolutionary developmental biology that have shed light on both of these areas of interest for me. And so the work that I'm doing is really quite traditional philosophical work involving marshaling all the evidence I can in support of a particular claim.
Sure.
And so the hope is that there is a book or maybe two books in here, but at the same time I'm also not convinced that the book is the only medium for me to express this work, and it might very well be the case that a series of articles will do the job better. And so right now I'm finally in a place where I've got the time and energy to devote to trying to figure out how best to shape the message and then get the message out there.
That sounds great. Well, so I think it looks like we're caught up. So you've come through your master's to PhD. Oh, hold on one second. To coming to Arizona State. You've been there since when? Is it 2000 and what? 2004. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Great. And you said you're doing mostly things with the Lincoln Center for Ethics. Are there any ethics projects you're excited about? Anything?
Yeah, absolutely. The one that I'll mention. So for what it's worth, the justification of science question and the translational research question are actually both ethical questions as much as epistemic ones for me, but obviously the sort of traditional domain of bioethics. So one other project that I've been working on and that I think is going to really take off in the next little while is a project focused on experimental research in the neurosciences with non-human primates in order to eventually translate those results into treatments or interventions that will be effective in humans. And as you may know, the whole area of non-human primate research is pretty fraught. There are a lot of concerns about not necessarily the mistreatment of animals. It's not the case that the animals are being treated differently from how they were supposed to be treated according to the protocol. But there's a concern that the protocols never should have been approved because we ought not to be non-human primates in the ways in which we treat them in the neurosciences in particular, but also in immunology research and so on. And so it's a kind of hot area, and I've been interested. One of the really great collaborations I've been able to develop that I think comes about precisely because I'm a faculty member in the biology department rather than on the other side of campus, is a project focused on invasive experimental research in non-human primates with some colleagues in bioengineering. And that really raises some very difficult questions about how, if at all, we can justify these kinds of animal experiments, and then if we can justify them, under what circumstances can we justify them, and are there exceptions to those circumstances? And so I know when you were here, you were involved in one of the early projects that had us collaborating.
Yeah, the Embedded Ethicist Project.
Yes, the Embedded Ethicist Project, where we were trying to find ways to create more traction for students in the sciences and in ethics to be able to communicate with each other and maybe even work together on projects so that we would end up with a kind of mutual trust, as well as a sense that ethics is an enabler of good science rather than the way ethics is too often seen, namely as an obstacle to science, period. And so and a lot of that work we've done with colleagues in the biological sciences and in bioengineering. And again, the emphasis for me has been on non-human primates, but there are lots of other ways to go.
Great. And so will we expect any papers coming out about these projects? Or
yes,
are these
you will expect all kinds of papers.
Very excited. Okay.
Yeah. In fact, I'm really keen. At this point in time, we've got a number of things that are very, very close to being ready to be submitted or resubmitted. So I'm expecting a relatively large number of publications in 2017 coming out. It's a bit of a sort of backlog that we're processing, but it's also,
sure.
I think, because some of the debates that I've been interested in for a long time turn out to be perennial debates. And, think about something like the limits of genetics and understanding, say, human cognition. This is something that I was, adamant about in the 90s, that there are distinct limits and that they should be obvious. And that was a kind of radical thing to say back then. But it's also, I think, now become quite commonplace. And so some of the things that I've been working on for a long time, I think, are now finally achieving a kind of notoriety that means we're especially ripe for some new publications.
Oh, that's great. Well, it's been great chatting with you so far, Jason. Is there anything else you'd like to discuss, or any other projects? Or
not at all. I do think it would be great to have everybody buy a copy of the Frankenstein edition that comes out next year.
Okay, yeah. So what is it just called? Will it be good Frankenstein? Is there be a subtitle or anything we can look for?
Yeah, I think it's called Frankenstein, an edition annotated for scientists, engineers, and creators of all types.
I love that, creators of all types. How do you guys decide on that?
Yeah, well, part of it is that so much of the experimental work that's happening, and the sort of, if you like, almost tinkering that's happening in with regard to, say, what it means to be human, or how to transform biological or how to change biological properties, or how to transform entities. A lot of this work is being done by folks who are do-it-yourselfers rather than formal scientists and engineers. And so we want it to be the case that that we're thinking about things like synthetic biology and robotics and genetically engineered machines and all that stuff. We're thinking about it not just as the project of government-funded scientists in university settings, but also the stuff that some major corporations and some regular people are actively involved in as well.
Well, that sounds great. We'll be looking forward to that. That's coming out in spring of 2017?
That's correct. Just in time for course adoption for the 200th anniversary of Mary Shelley's book.
Wonderful. And I'm sure every instructor should be racing to their library to be ordering this for course adoption. So.
I wouldn't race to the library. I'd race to the website. Order it order it for yourself and then get the library to buy it.
That's library. Yeah, of course. All right, Jason. Well, it's been a real pleasure chatting with you. Thank you so much. It's amazing, as someone as yourself who, like you said, has worked very hard from the beginning to come together and figure out how to make the connections. You're still doing it to this day, and I got to say, yeah, it's very impressive to watch you work, and we're really excited to see what comes out in the future.
Thanks very much, Nick, and likewise.
Okay, take care. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks. Bye now.